this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
This message is brought to you by Apple Card. Apple Card members can earn unlimited daily cash back on everyday purchases wherever they shop. This means you could be earning daily cash on just about anything, like a slice of pizza from your local pizza place or a latte from the corner coffee shop. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app to see your credit limit offer in minutes. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com. You know how it's never really about where you're going, it's about who you're going with? The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1088 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get into the mailbag questions, I just want to send a reminder to check out the Late Round Prospect Guide. You get info on all of the ZAP models, there's player write-ups, rankings, bad dad jokes, and more, all for $19.99. It's over 170 pages of content. Learn more over on lateround.com. The first mailbag question this week is from Twitter. It's from @HannibalLecta. It says, possible Jaylen Waddle implications. Willis running more? Draft a top wide receiver? Achane to the moon? Okay, so I talked about this a little bit on the Late Round show on Wednesday, and I'm sure some of you listened to that in the podcast feed yesterday. Or maybe you just watched it on YouTube. Regardless, let's talk about this trade. I think Jaylen Waddle is a very good wide receiver. He's been at or above a 2.19 yards per route run rate in 3 of 5 seasons. That's no easy feat. Anything above 2 is usually really strong at wide receiver. He's typically been in that 22 to 24% target share range. His targets per route run, that's been good too. He can line up all over the field. When he's healthy, Jaylen Waddle is really good. And when you look at Denver's wide receiver room, you get a lot of okay to good players. None are as good as Waddle, even Courtland Sutton. I mean, you can just look at yards per route run to help tell that story. Sutton has been on teams with weaker competition than Jaylen Waddle. At least you can argue that. And he's been above a yards per route run rate of 2 just once in his career. And that came all the way back in 2019. I genuinely believe that Jaylen Waddle is in a different tier, especially at this point in their careers. Sutton's going to be 31 in October. Last season, Troy Franklin started to lose a little bit of work to Pat Bryant. And while I did think Bryant was a trade throw-in type at the start of the offseason as a buy candidate, it's not like he's proven to be special. My thinking at this point is that Bryant can rotate in a little bit and play the slot. Sutton on the outside, Waddle can line up everywhere. And then Troy Franklin, he might be screwed the most out of all these wide receivers. Regardless, Waddle steps in. He's the best wideout on this team. He can see a 22 to 24% target share because good players create opportunity. And Denver's been above 0 in pass rate over expected over the last 2 years. They were 4th in the NFL last year in pass attempts. It's a good place for Jaylen Waddle to land. Now, when you look at Miami, I have seen a lot of these takes, like this question is asking, of Achane to the moon. I'm not really there. Achane's coming off a season where he had a 19% target share. That was in a Mike McDaniel offense that definitely favors his type of play style. It's just straight up not easy for a running back to hit that high of a target share. We at least wouldn't lock him into that. We've seen 27 running back seasons since 2011 with a 19% target share or better. Christian McCaffrey owns 5 of those seasons. Alvin Kamara has 5 more of them. It's just not a common thing to have happen. And in today's NFL, it's happening less. Target share, it's shifting more to tight end than it is to running backs. So to me, the departure of Mike McDaniel was bad for Devon Achane. Maybe this Waddle move helps things a little bit, but I don't think we should lose sight of that greater picture. Not only that, but how good is this offense actually going to be? We want our running backs and our players in general to play in good offenses. The Dolphins have wide receiver 3s and wide receiver 4s as starters right now, which hopefully will change. But it's going to be a questionable offense. And maybe you feel that way about last year's Dolphins, but they were 22nd in touchdowns per game. That could be worse. Malik Willis gets a downgrade here too. He can still be plenty fantasy relevant because of his rushing. But losing Jaylen Waddle is definitely tough because they won't be adding anyone more than likely who's as good as Waddle here in 2026, unless someone really hits from the NFL draft. So those are my overall thoughts. I don't have season-long rankings done quite yet, and we're working on projections. But I think this is a good thing for Waddle's sustainability. It's a more pass-heavy offense. The weapons are beatable, and he's just really good. And I don't want to overcount it on the volume end for Devon Achane. This next one's also from Twitter. It's from @GH_Horsfield. It says, which running back room is a sneaky good landing spot for a non-Jeremiah Love draft pick? Seattle, Minnesota, Washington, maybe Baltimore? Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones with openings should be on everyone's radar. Seattle, Minnesota, Washington, those are the teams with immediate needs. And then I look at other teams who may not have absolute studs, who may at least consider doing something in the draft, potentially to add depth. Chicago's one if they want to get a little bit more depth in competition. Carolina, the exact same reason. I think Chase Brown is good, but you never know with Cincinnati. And Dallas could definitely use some help behind Javonte Williams. And I still think, despite what they did this offseason, that Denver and Houston should both be on our radars right now too. And then I look at the teams who have running backs who are set to become free agents next year or after the 2026 season. The problem is, this isn't the kind of draft class where you really want to hold on to that player into the 2027 season when you know that he'll do nothing in 2026, because this draft class doesn't have a ton of talent. Usually, if we're looking at day 3 picks, I think that's what the majority of these running backs, where they're going to land. We want to find better situations for that immediate upside and that value jump in Dynasty. But there's some players set to be free agents next year where their teams might be looking to add. Specifically, you have the Jets and the Colts. Breece Hall and Jonathan Taylor, their contracts are up. But that's not to say that I think those guys are actually going to be free agents. So those are some of the teams where there are some possibilities. It sounds like half the NFL, but really, it's just a lot of these NFL teams could go either way given what they have right now. Like the Bears. That's a great example. They could very easily just go after more depth. This next question says, hey JJ, as a first-time buyer of the prospect guide, I found myself wondering about the historical comps of this incoming tight end class, specifically Stowers and Sadiq. Would you say this could be a Loveland and Warren situation in terms of expectations for these two and the gap between tight end 1 and tight end 2? How much are their combines warping market perception? And how early would you be willing to take each of them in rookie drafts without tight end premium, without Superflex? Andrew. So all of my rookie rankings are in that guide. You can see the rankings at the end. This is a very weak class overall, in my opinion, like at all positions combined. So I think both Sadiq and Stowers, they're first rounders in single quarterback leagues, in non-tight end premium leagues, because things are just rough out there. The tight end ZAP model likes Sadiq more than Stowers, and it's by a relatively decent margin. That's because Sadiq is projected to go well ahead of Stowers in the draft right now. Realistically, if you look at their breakout scores, which is the same methodology that I use at wide receiver, they're not that far off. Stowers actually has a better breakout score. I think Stowers has a better production profile overall. But this is not a Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland situation because I don't think either of these guys are as good as them. Maybe Sadiq, but when you combine his player comps with his production profile, it's a little bit scary. I'm not going to lie. Last year's tight end ZAP model, it liked Colston Loveland most. You guys saw that in the prospect guide. This new model that Brandon Gadula and I worked on, it likes Loveland arguably more than last year's model. Loveland's breakout score is elite, whereas Sadiq's is more in line with Tyler Warren. So maybe the proper way to think of this is that Sadiq is more like Warren than he is Loveland as a prospect, just from a ZAP score perspective. But as a pairing, Stowers just doesn't match up because he's not projected to go in the first round. Draft capital doesn't mean everything, but when modeling, it still gets signal, significant signal. But that doesn't mean that I don't like Stowers. I do a lot. He's basically the 4th best tight end out of these last 2 draft classes, according to the model. Though he's not that far from Terrence Ferguson and Harold Fannin. And that's with mid-second round draft capital. Sadiq just scares me more subjectively. His breakout score is fine, but there are other metrics out there like yards per route run that don't paint him very favorably. And his comps in the ZAP model, they're fine. They're not elite. Noah Fant, OJ Howard, Evan Ingram. So overall, I'm definitely giving the edge to last year's top 2 tight ends over this year's. And that's not based off of their NFL production. This isn't a hindsight take. That's just based on them as prospects. This next question is from Mike on Patreon. It says, the Rams and Patriots have been rumored to be in talks with the Eagles for A.J. Brown, with his contract making this more of a post-6-1 thing. What's the possible ceiling on A.J., and should we be buying low as he continues to fall down startup and best ball draft boards? Brown had a down year by his standards. And just through film evaluation, I do think he took a step back. But the market is saying all of that, right? At this time last year, A.J. Brown was a top 15 dynasty wide receiver, according to Keep Trade Cut. Right now, according to that same source, he's wide receiver 26. Brown has seen yards per route run rates over 2 in every season of his career. That's wild. That's amazing. And that still includes last year. Despite all the crap that people were saying, A.J. Brown had a 2.06 yards per route run rate. Brown didn't even have that bad of a year in PPR points per game. The problem and the difference is that he'd been above 2.5 in yards per route run every other season of his career. And Brown did that with a very similar catchable targets rate. I don't think this is purely a Jalen Hurts thing last year, but I do think it could be an offensive system thing. The offense itself didn't set him up to do a whole lot. The lack of motion, the lack of creativity, but 70% of Brown's targets were catchable. That was 71% in 2024, 78% in 2023. That's according to PFF data. What I don't want to do is be unfair to A.J. Brown because of his baseline. Because he's usually just really good, and he wasn't as good last year. Like, if this were any other wide receiver at this age, and he's coming off a year with that kind of yards per route run rate, and a very reasonable 24% targets per route run rate, I would say he's doing pretty well for a guy in his late 20s. But I do think the downward trajectory has started with A.J. Brown. It's just that trajectory is beginning at a very high place because A.J. Brown is really good. And it's not just because those metrics are lower than A.J. Brown's typical averages, but he also had the second lowest ADOT of his career last year, which can often lead itself to better yards after the catch numbers. But Brown had his worst yak per reception season of his career. Just don't confuse that with being bad. Like, I've said for years that Perfect Dark is a better Nintendo 64 game than GoldenEye. It's literally just a better version of what GoldenEye was. You can debate me all day on that. But that doesn't mean that I think GoldenEye is bad. Just like A.J. Brown had better seasons than his 2025 season, but that 2025 season wasn't bad. And per route run metrics, they're not everything. ESPN's Open Score actually put Brown 9th last year. His overall score, according to their methodology, was 6th. So I think what this is all saying is that if you're rebuilding, you probably don't need to take this on. Generally speaking, when a player is around that age apex and things start to fall off, I don't want to buy into that this time of year. I'll do it more mid-season when I know where my dynasty team is at and if I'm truly competitive. And that way, you also know how effective that player is actually performing. There's really not a need to buy into Brown right now because even if he does get traded, do we think his cost is going to substantially be higher than it is right now? And I feel pretty similarly about best ball and from a redraft perspective. His early ADP is in that like high-end wide receiver 2 range. It's wide receiver 13 over on DraftKings right now in their best ball contests. I really don't think that's a clear buy situation. And yes, keep in mind, I haven't done my rankings yet. We're just starting to build projections. We're working on it. But there's some very good wide receivers with a whole lot of upside being drafted around like wide receiver 25. So his ADP might be slipping, but I don't think it's slipping enough. And by the way, if you look at early ADP, it's shaping up to be similar as last year, where you get a running back or two early, and then there's that group, that range of wide receivers where there's just a lot of upside that we're going to want to choose from. But this is just one of those situations where I don't think you need to be aggressive either way right now, especially on the buy side. I wouldn't be actively trying to be overweight with A.J. Brown at this moment. His cost is still relatively high in redraft, and I don't think the dynasty price is going to rise that dramatically, even if he is traded. And some of these destinations don't guarantee a better outlook for A.J. Brown versus his outlook in Philadelphia in a new offensive system. Keep that in mind too. Now, the last one today is focused more on my methodology, but I think it needs to be said. It's an email that says, "Hey JJ, as someone who has purchased your draft guide every year, prospect guide, I noticed the grading methodology has changed this year and is particularly noticeable on the high end. For example, you list Rome Odunze as 80.2, whereas he was previously a 96.5 in your model. Could you elaborate on this new scaling a bit? I am curious where Jeremiah Love would have landed in the previous methodology. Similarly, where would some of the high-end prospects from previous years land in the new methodology? Thanks, Alex." So I've gotten more responses about this new score scaling than I anticipated. So I figured I can just throw everything out there right now on this show. We're all on the same page. Hopefully this helps. And I can reference this episode when those questions come in. And I think a lot of you are going to be interested in this. And look, I understand the questions. I understand why I'm getting them. But let's get some clear-cut answers here. First, if you have the prospect guide, there's a section in it on interpreting the data where it talks through some of this. But basically, the way the model's always worked is that it spits out some sort of raw number, some score. But that score doesn't make any sense to even me. Because just based on the inputs and the proper weight for those inputs, it might be like 23 for an elite running back. That's not easily digestible. So what I've done in the past is I've made those scores into percentiles. If you go back to the very first late round prospect guide, I actually call those scores percentiles. When you transfer scores to percentiles, you make them on a scale from 0 to 100. The problem in doing that, though, is that percentiles, they're linear in nature, right? It's one better than the next, better than the next. And that can create a lot of problems that I've tried to address, but I didn't fully address until last year. Last year, for example, I started creating categories. The categories would group prospects by their raw prospect score, not their percentile score. And the reason for doing these categories is that you could group players up based on that raw score, and they wouldn't be skewed by the ranking system of percentiles. You get a better idea of where drop-offs might occur. It could help with interpreting some of these percentiles. But the true problem with all of this is that percentiles, like I said, they're linear in nature. Adding categories doesn't change that. And when something is linear, you're not properly seeing where the gaps exist from one player to the next. Not only that, and more importantly, if you were to only look at percentile scores, they're not nearly as predictive as the raw output that the model was generating per player. So I just decided to fix all of it this year. Instead of percentiles, you're getting more accurate numbers of what the model is actually saying about these players. And what that means is there's a larger separation between the elite players. Rome Odunze in that 2024 draft class was the example that I showed in the guide. There's a little graphic in there. Under the previous methodology, Odunze had a score of 96.5, which was 3 points off of where Marvin Harrison was and where Malik Neighbors was. Xavier Legette had an old score of 82, Malik Washington 53, all in the same class. But now, Odunze's score dropped from 96.5 to about 80. Legette went from 82 to under 60. Washington's goes from 53 to 21. With percentiles before this change, too much real estate was taken up by the undrafted and day 3 picks. You weren't really capturing the true value differences from one wide receiver to the next or one running back to the next. Because again, with percentiles, every player gets their little piece of that pie from 0 to 100. The worst is 0, the best is 100. So if we have a ton of these low-tiered players, that means a day 3 pick like Malik Washington will still get a score over 50. Because there are so many players who are making up that 0 to 50 range. Really, when it came to relevant players, the ZAP model was scaling those players from 50 to 100, not 0 to 100. Because there are so many players who go undrafted or who get drafted on day 3 who just don't matter that much from a fantasy football perspective. It wasn't that the results were any different, or my interpretation of that data was any different in the guide. I still feel the same way about those players today that I would have in 2023 or 2024. Though the model has changed because I try to iterate that model year in and year out to make it better. It's just a slight rebrand. It's like when a company changes their logo. It's still the same company, People are just interacting with that company in a different way. The actual calculations of scores didn't dramatically change year over year. The raw numbers, they're mostly the same, aside from those changes that I made in the models, which are all listed throughout the guide. But this allows us to better interpret the results and see those gaps. For instance, Malik Neighbors is now just one of a handful of wide receivers with a score of 100 in that model. His old ZAP score was 99.5. But now there's a cluster of prospects with a score of 100. And that's a 20-point gap from him to Odunze, which allows you to really see that there's a pretty significant difference in their outlooks. But before, someone might read the guide and be like, oh, there's only a 3-point gap between Malik Neighbors and Rome Odunze. That's not that big of a deal. But that is a big deal. One of the toughest parts of my job is interpreting this data to thousands of people. I'm not going to say that it's easy, because it's not. But it's also part of my job. It's on me to properly communicate these ideas so that we're all on the same page. And so that you feel comfortable with how to take the information that I give you and act on it in fantasy football. Now, stemming from these changes, I've gotten a lot of requests from people to see scores from previous classes. And again, I understand anyone wanting that. I get it. It's a reasonable request. I do want to say that you can see last year's class scores in the year 2 section. Each player's profile has their ZAP score listed. But when it comes to previous class data, I don't publish it for a reason. Just to reiterate and to be clear, a lot of people are consuming this content, and I'm unbelievably grateful for that. But if I'm being completely transparent, and I'm really being vulnerable here, if I were to just say, oh, here's the database of scores from previous classes, the floodgates would open. My inbox, my DMs, the late round Discord. It'll just be people asking about why this player had this score or why this player had that score. And I know that to be the case because that already happens anytime I post my rankings. Literally the instant I update my dynasty rankings, I'm flooded with responses, which is great. It's a necessary part of my job. I'm not complaining. I'm just being open and honest. I can't take that on when it comes to prospecting. I can do it with rankings because those rankings are immediately useful. If I did it with the prospects, we'd be dissecting players who were drafted 4 years ago, when that score isn't even relevant anymore. I just don't have the capacity to manage all of that. Not even from a time perspective, but from a mental health perspective. It's not like I'm hiding something here, you guys. If you guys want to talk about a specific player, what his score was in the ZAP model, I'm more than willing to talk about that. I do it all the time on Discord. We talk about where that player ranked, his ZAP score, all that good stuff. And I share screenshots of the spreadsheets. But having just 800 different wide receivers and their scores just out there, I can't do it, man. I just can't do it. That takes a ton of management capacity that I cannot do. And one of the main reasons that I price the guides where I price them, which I think are very fair prices for what you get, is because I feel like I'm giving you guys a very fair amount of content for that price. And I'm not going to come out here and say, hey, if you want the full database, give me $200. That's not what this business is about. That's not how I operate. This is not some money grab. Maybe people would buy that, but that defeats the purpose of what I just said, which is the management side of all of that and the mental health side of all of that. You're more than welcome to ask about individual players, though. But like if anyone's trying to compare a prospect to one in the past because you want to take some action on your dynasty team, like create a trade based on those scores, I wouldn't even do that. The ZAP scores are how we viewed those players as prospects entering the league. We shouldn't view those players the exact same way after they've played in the NFL. That's why something like the year 2 model exists. So look, I know I got deeper than anticipated here, but I wanted to be open about why I make the choices that I make. But the bottom line is that I'm trying to make things as consumable and easy to understand as humanly possible for you guys. That's on me. That's my job. But I also can't just publish everything in the database because it genuinely would probably destroy my day-to-day workflow. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to be transparent. It just means that I can't focus all my time and energy on the ZAP model and the prospects in that model. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I greatly appreciate all of you. Have a great weekend. I'll catch you next week.
I'm Daniel Jeremiah.
And I am Greg Rosenthal.
I know that, Greg. We're teaming up on 40s and Free Agents, the podcast that owns the NFL offseason.
This is where teams are built. Free agency, the combine, pro days, trades. Every move matters.
From my draft boards and mock drafts
to my vaunted top 101 free agents and how rosters come together.
Quarterback movement,
surprise signings.
We'll tell you what it means and who really wins. Open your free iHeartRadio app, search 40s and Free Agents, and listen now.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.